Okay, welcome to the Ancien Regime. So this is part of my French Revolution series for A-level. So this is not a history GCSE lesson. It's an A-level lesson. Anyway, so I've already recorded this lesson, but I discovered that I didn't turn my microphone on. And so I sent it to myself, uploaded to YouTube. It came through silently. So I'm doing this again. So hopefully this should be a better bit of teaching. The Ancien Regime. So what was the Ancien Regime? To give you some context, Louis XIV attempted to reform France, to centralize it in order to enhance the power of the crown over the nobility. To that extent, he was successful. He actually moved the capital of France to the Palace of Versailles. You've probably heard of Versailles because of the Treaty of Versailles. But yes, the Palace of Versailles was something that Louis XIV created. Now, you will see I have not written about Louis XVI yet, who was the monarch in charge during the French Revolution. Now, whilst Louis XIV was broadly successful in homogenizing or creating a better power base for himself against his more powerful nobles, there were taxation abnormalities or anomalies between different parts of France, and I'll discuss that in a future slide. So what was the Ancien Regime? Essentially, it was the organization of French society on a governmental basis, and society was split three ways. The first estate was the clergy, the Catholic Church. Now, the Catholic Church was enormously rich because many French peasants, even though they were dirt poor, would give 10% of their income to the Catholic Church, called a tithe. That's a biblical kind of law. And the reason that they would do that was because they would be afraid if they didn't, that they would go to hell. The second estate was the nobility and the royals. 2% of the population, they own 20% of the land, so they're grotesquely rich. And the third estate is quite eclectic because you've got the bourgeoisie, and these were often literate, merchants and artisans, skilled workers, city workers like the proletariat, so poor people working in factories and, as it says on their cooks, etc. And then most of France was actually an agricultural society, a farming society. So the peasants made up 80% of the French population. So you have a very disparate and unequal society, especially with regard to the first two estates and the third estate. And that third estate was quite powerless to affect change. So that created a lot of frustration. Now, you have the Enlightenment, and this mad lad here, this is Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and he delivers a devastating Mack-Poole style right hook, or it's actually a left hook, to the Ancien Regime, which is personified by Louis XVI there. Now, he writes two main pieces of writing. So he writes a social contract, and he writes a discourse on the unequal, I can't remember quite the title, but a discourse on the unequal treatment of men, where he, in both of these seminal pieces of work, he essentially argues that rule by royals is essentially tyranny, and that equality is a noble thing to aspire towards, or at least a less unequal society is a noble cause to aspire towards. Also, don't think that he's the only Enlightenment thinker. I wouldn't want to be a Paine there. And I say that because Thomas Paine is at the bottom left. Now, you should be learning with Mr. Whitney. But Thomas Paine wrote Common Sense. And Common Sense was an attack on the British government ruling in what was the 13 colonies, which became the USA. Thomas Paine, very odd figure, even though he's massive in the American Revolution. He was born in England. He actually lived in France, and he wrote pamphlets which were anti-authoritarian. He believed in that power needed to be divided so that no one agent in the state could become like a dictator. And obviously, we've got Marat there, and Marat is an Enlightenment thinker who advocated for grotesque violence against the first two estates and anyone who was a counter-revolutionary in essence. So what you can see with these three Enlightenment thinkers, you need to have three primary sources in your NEA. And these are three Enlightenment thinkers that are really good to go to, and especially as the title of your NEA is about whether the Enlightenment was the most significant cause in the causation, of the French Revolution, these three Enlightenment thinkers, if you can find quotes from these guys, they'll be very good to analyze. And you've got to think about, who was the most influential. Was it been Jean-Jacques Rousseau? He did write in French. Would it have been Marat, who was on the ground at the time? Would it have been Thomas Paine? How widely would his works have been translated into French? So you've got to think about their kind of impact on the revolution. I would definitely say that Marat has a huge influence on the violence of the revolution. I will teach this, but essentially 40,000 people died in the Great Terror under Robespierre. But we'll look at that in a bit more detail. So you've got to think about the reality of inequality for France. So a little cheeky secret I'll let you know into is that the north of France and the south of France had two different broad government systems. So the north of France had a kind of French common law, and the south of France was still operating on a kind of Roman legal system. So there was a difference there. Also, what you had in these different French provinces, you could have different nobles who set different laws and different levels of taxes. So the Jebel tax was a salt tax, which was deeply unpopular with the peasantry. And in certain provinces, it was applied less stringently. So you've got inequality. And the thing is that inequality leads to tension in society. So if you think of like the 2011 riots or the protests that you've seen recently, you can see that if one strata of society feels that is unequal to other strata of society, that they raise their voices in quite militant language, and it can often end in violence. This is how humans express their frustration politically over many hundreds of years, thousands of years. That's what humans have done. So this inequality is a cancer for France. It eats away at France. It gnaws away at France. You can see why it's such a huge cause of the French Revolution. And this picture that you see before you, this is a great primary source, and it shows you the third estate there, malnourished through the famines and the very poor harvests caused by hailstorms. And you see King Louis Capet there riding on the third estate with the clergy and an aristocrat on the back. So what you can see is how parasitic these rich classes these were to an oppressed class, which is on the bottom, the peasantry. So the reality of inequality in French society is a massive causative agent for revolution. So you can see really the Ancien Regime created many problems, which led to the French Revolution. And also, it just couldn't justify itself in the way of the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment's criticism of the Ancien Regime, it delivered a hammer blow to King Louis XVI. The justification for royal tyranny, if is really how we should look at it like that, because really we're talking about dictatorial powers. There was no justification for it. So anyway, that is my kind of like very quick mini lecture analysis of the Ancien Regime and how it was a cause for the French Revolution. Okay, this is Mr. Mack-Poole signing out. So let's see, I will go to here, I will go to here, I will stop recording. All right, goodbye. Stop recording.